couple of months ago, I remember listening to this podcast where the guest was this priest chaplain who was the chaplain of the local schools in his area. So basically, he had the same position that I do right now. And he was talking about how he very consciously tries to embody various virtues associated with the idea of spiritual fatherhood. So, as to be expected, he named a whole bunch of virtues that you would typically associate with fatherhood, like being strong, being supportive, being present. But then before he was done, he mentioned almost in passing this idea of being vulnerable. And so again, the whole idea is that he very consciously tries to be vulnerable for the sake of the students under his care. And I remember at the time kind of thinking to myself, like, wow, that's kind of unusual. You don't hear that every day. You don't hear the notion of vulnerability typically associated with the notion of virtue, much less a virtue which is meant to support the vocation of fatherhood. But, there it was. And I have to admit that at the time, I didn't really pursue the idea any further, but it just so happens that in the context of God's providence, he himself would bring that same concept to my attention kind of later on in my spiritual journey. So very recently, about a month ago, I was watching the first episode of this TV show called Superman and Lois, which basically focuses on that iconic superhero from DC Comics, Superman, aka Clark Kent, and his marriage to Lois Lane, and their common struggle to raise their two teenage boys, one of whom suffers from social anxiety, the other one being more of a confident jock type. And going into the show, I kind of had this expectation that the thing would focus primarily on the notion of life-work balance. And it certainly does that, but it actually goes a little bit further. And so early on in the show, Clark Kent is talking to his mother, Martha, and basically she's saying to him, like, you got to spend more time with your family. And so after Clark says to her that he has a responsibility to the world as Superman, she responds by saying that he has a greater responsibility to his own family. And then she goes on to say this: the boys need to learn from you what it looks like to be a strong, loving, and vulnerable man, as your father did for you. And so again, there's an idea again, right? The virtue of vulnerability, and in particular this idea that the virtue of vulnerability is very much in service of the vocation of fatherhood. Now, after seeing that scene, I remember thinking to myself, I wonder if they're going to develop this idea even further. Again, this notion of the importance of being vulnerable, especially with your kids. And to my pleasant surprise, the show actually kind of took the thing and ran with it. And so again, early on in the show, Clark Kent kind of walks in on one of his sons, the one who suffers from social anxiety, and he sees that he's playing this video game. And the game he's playing is basically this fighting game involving various characters from the Mortal Kombat universe and DC Comics. And specifically, he's involved in this game where two characters are facing off. One is Raiden, and the other one, ironically, is Superman. And at this point, neither one of Clark Kent's sons actually knows his secret identities, right? So this is kind of like this thing that's playing out in the background. In any case, Clark kind of sees this playing out, and he says to his son, oh gosh, like you're playing Superman. In response to which the son says, well, no, Superman is boring. And in this, the son is touching upon, of course, a really important problem when it comes to portraying Superman in arts, whether we're talking about in the context of a TV show, a movie, or whatever the case may be. And so the whole idea is that because Superman is so perfect, so without flaw, he seems kind of unrelatable, and therefore boring. And again, that's the particular issue that the son is touching upon when he says that the character of Superman inherently is boring. And so basically what happens is that before the scene kind of comes to a close, even though Clark offers to speak to his son about whatever issues might be on his mind, the son just completely ignores him. He responds with indifference. Because the whole idea is that why should I talk to you about my vulnerabilities when you're so perfect, when you're so unrelatable and therefore boring? Later on, the same son has this life-changing encounter with this girl that he originally met during his youth. And so early on in the show, it's strongly implied that the son's latent powers are kind of awakened in a certain sense when he receives the love from this girl, when he's kind of loved in his vulnerability. And in particular, it happens in this moment where she offers him her phone number as opposed to offering her number to the more confident brother, if you will. And this theme is further developed later on in the show when the girl reveals to this guy that she actually has the same problems that he has. Psychological issues with medication and whatnot. And the experience is so powerful for him, this idea, again, of shared vulnerability, that he doesn't know what to do with it, right? It's so foreign to him and yet so attractive, such that he basically leans in to kiss her without realizing that she has a boyfriend. In any case, by the end of that first episode, Clark sort of changes gears a little bit. And so instead of trying so hard to be like the strong and perfect dad as he was trying for most of the show, he kind of changes things up and takes a chance to be vulnerable before his son. Sort of saying to his son, like, I'm not perfect, I've made mistakes, will you forgive me? And then making a firm resolution to try better in the future. And ironically, that's the moment that the bond is forged between father and son. Because here's Clark Kent finally embodying the virtue of vulnerability for the sake of his kids. Now, the reason why I'm spending so much time on the notion of vulnerability is because this particular theme of vulnerability is actually a really prominent feature when it comes to the Catholic faith, in a way which people often overlook. But before I kind of expound upon that in a more abstract sort of way, perhaps I might kind of frame the issue for you a little more tightly by telling you about my last haircut, actually. So basically, for the last couple of years when I've been living in Oshawa, I've been going to the same barber. This guy who is really good at his job and is actually a practicing Muslim. And I realize that kind of sounds like the beginning of a joke, a practicing Muslim and a Catholic priest walk into a shop, but, that's our lives, right? In any case, the last time I went in for a haircut, we were talking about our respective religions. And specifically, he was talking to me about how Muslims take great care in terms of washing themselves before engaging in the process of prayer. So besides more obvious things like, for example, washing your face, he also said that Muslims take great care in terms of washing up to their elbows, washing underneath their fingernails, and even making sure that in areas that have hair, to make sure that the water actually touches the skin underneath the hair. So it was actually kind of interesting. But I remember as he was speaking, kind of thinking to myself two things. First of all, this notion that the Muslim faith does a really great job in terms of extolling and protecting the great transcendence of God. And so the whole idea here is that because God is all-powerful and all-holy, the Alpha and the Omega, the creator of the universe and whatnot, he sort of implicitly demands our utmost reverence and respect, as expressed in concrete action. But you see, the second thing that occurred to me is, of course, what we believe in contrast as Catholics. So it's kind of interesting. The Catholic position is that certainly we should respect and uphold the transcendence of God, right? So we believe all those things. God is all-powerful, he is all-holy, the Alpha, the Omega, the creator of the universe. Again, all those different things we believe as a Catholic people. At the same time, what's the great novelty of the Christian faith? The transcendent God has made himself immanent. He has become the child in the manger shivering in the cold. He has become the crucified Lord bleeding out on the cross. In other words, a transcendent God, the all-powerful, almighty God, has allowed himself to be vulnerable. And you see, the thing I want to impress upon you is that has two implications for us, practically speaking. First of all, if you think it through for a sec, if God has chosen to make himself vulnerable, if the transcendent God has chosen to make himself vulnerable, therefore implicitly he's inviting us to relationship. He's inviting us to intimacy. Because of course, what is intimacy but shared vulnerability? But you see, the second thing is this. If Christ has constantly chosen to make himself vulnerable, specifically on the cross for the salvation of the world, well then therefore we ourselves who are called to be disciples of the Lord, other Christ in this world, are called to do the same. To have the courage to stay in that place of vulnerability, not simply for the sake of relationship with God, but also to help facilitate the salvation of the world. The example that comes to mind, there's this really great book by Matthew Kelly called Rediscovering Catholicism, which is really helpful for fallen away Catholics to sort of rediscover their faith. And early on in the book, Matthew Kelly talks about three secular philosophies which have come to kind of dominate the modern world: individualism, hedonism, and minimalism. And so individualism is basically about the exaltation of the self. I am the most important being in the universe. Hedonism is all about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And minimalism is a little bit different, but it's sort of similar, right? So the idea of maximizing reward with the minimum amount of effort. And the thing I want to impress upon you is that the common denominator between all these different philosophies is basically a fear of suffering, is a fear of pain, which basically amounts to a refusal to be vulnerable. Because even in the case of individualism, what's basically behind that? This idea that I'm so afraid of losing myself that I can't take my focus off of myself. And so therefore I have no room for the other, if you will. In any case, John Paul II actually talks about this when he says that even though it's possible in a certain sense to live one's life to kind of minimize pain and inconvenience in one's circumstances, it comes at a terrible price. It comes at the expense of your humanity. Because if you think about it, how can you have authentic relationships and friendships in the absence of trust? Or how can you love authentically another person if you're unwilling to risk actually having your heart broken? And how can you participate in the salvation of the world if you simply refuse to accept the suffering Christ, who suffered and died for the salvation of the world? And so in a certain sense, it's very much in keeping with Matthew 16. Whoever wishes to save their life will lose it. Whoever wishes to lose their life for the sake of Christ and the kingdom of heaven will actually save it. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. So I remember a couple months ago watching this really great one-man comedy special by this really great comedian named Hasan Minhaj called Homecoming King, which apparently won this Peabody Award for excellence in storytelling. And so the first half of the show is basically about Hasan's experience as a Muslim immigrant moving from India to the United States. But the second half of the show is kind of interesting. It's kind of the reason why it's called Homecoming King. It focuses on his struggle to get over the pain and trauma that he suffered in the context of his high school prom. And so basically, as the story goes, Hasan fell in love with this Caucasian girl that he kind of names Bethany Reed throughout the course of the show. So obviously it's a pseudonym, right? And as he puts it, even though they were in AP calculus, they had chemistry, right? And so in the aftermath of a sort of stolen kiss in the midst of some study session, they decided to go to the prom together. But then what happened is that when he finally arrived at her home on the night of prom, he kind of looked and saw that there was this other guy, this Caucasian guy, putting a corsage in Bethany's wrist. And so basically Bethany's mother spoke to him and said, well, look, we have a lot of family at home in Nebraska. There's going to be a lot of photos taken tonight. And honey, even though we like you, we don't think that you'll be a good fit, if you will. Now, obviously, it was a really painful and, again, traumatic experience for Hasan, but the turning point in terms of his own personal journey to ultimately forgive Bethany took place in the context of a conversation that he had with his father. And so basically in the aftermath of this heart attack, which almost killed Hasan's father, the two of them were having a conversation at the hospital during which Hasan told his father about what happened on prom night for the very first time. As a result of which his father said to him, Hasan, I'm very disappointed in you. And initially Hasan was like, yeah, I know, Dad, I shouldn't have kissed the girl. But then the father said to him, well, no, like, why haven't you forgiven Bethany? And then he went on to explain that when he first immigrated to the United States, he was watching a lot of TV shows, and he was worried that if he allowed his son to go to a school dance, he would get a girl pregnant, join a gang, and become a drug dealer all on the same night. And so his point was that if I had developed a negative bias towards Caucasian people as a result of watching TV, what kind of negative bias have they developed by kind of watching things on TV, listening to the media and whatnot? And so we're both kind of afraid of each other. But then he said this, your courage to do what is right must be greater than your fear. Your courage to do what is right must be greater than your fear. And then he concluded by saying this, Hasan, be brave. Hasan, be brave. Hasan, be brave. Now, obviously, that's one very specific example, but hopefully you can see where we're going with this, right? Because within that story is an enduring lesson for each one of us. Because the reality is that even though life can be painful and the actions of people can be extremely disappointing, you must never be defeated by the experience of pain. And more to the point, you must never allow your primary motivation in this life to be the avoidance of pain or the fear of suffering. But instead, your primary motivation should always be to do what is right, to do God's will in the context of this world, no matter the personal cost to yourself. And whenever you're inclined to doubt the veracity of this point or to kind of deviate from the plan because of your fear of suffering or pain, think back to Jesus Christ. Think back to the child Jesus shivering in the cold. Think about the crucified Christ hanging and dying for the salvation of the world. And if it helps, think back to Hasan Minhaj's father. And put yourself in that space and imagine God the Father speaking to you those same words, as I'm sure he did on some level to Jesus Christ himself. Jesus, be brave. Hasan, be brave. Sons and daughters of Christ the King, take courage and be brave. And may God bless you all.